to me, it's really a combination of those two: communicating your value with impact and building a network of an awareness and knowledge of what goes on in the business so that you can build your career.
To be honest with you, for my first 5 years of my career, was heavily debating, do I want to pursue the corporate ladder route or do I want to go into entrepreneurship?
The other piece is big picture thinking, looking at the organization, but looking at the marketplace and looking at it all holistically would be the second piece. But a true leader is not only being able to identify the opportunities, but having the flexibility and self-awareness to let it go.
Well, we are live. We are back. Welcome to this episode of the How to Get a Job podcast. Look, if you're listening to this and you're someone that has aspirations to climb the corporate ladder, if you're listening to this and you have aspirations to become an executive, to become a director, to become a vice president and on, then this is the podcast episode for you, ladies and gentlemen, because look, you all know, I say this all the time, there's no better way to reach any goal than to learn from someone who has done it, right? And that is why I'm super excited for today's guest. I have Tony Bagnato, and I think I said it wrong, even though we practiced a million times, but Tony, welcome to the show. Tony is focused on empowering leaders to have a career success that they desire and deserve. And he's an executive coach who was an executive. And that's why I'm super excited to have this conversation with you, Tony. Welcome. How are you?
Daniel, outstanding. I do really appreciate you reaching out to me about a month ago to connect. And, you know, I've come in that month to really appreciate you and your business and really come to admire your approach and also your work ethic. I mean, I don't know if there's a person out there that works harder than you.
Kylie, what is it? The mom of the Jenners.
Okay,
somebody
yeah,
says
that's fair.
The devil works hard, but Mari, our marketing manager, if you're watching this, we were talking about this. That woman works extremely hard.
Yeah.
But anyways, besides that, I do think I have a strong work ethic, so I appreciate you acknowledging that, Tony, because that's probably one of the things that I'm most proud of, because I don't believe I'm the smartest person, but I do believe that I'm one of the hardest working person, and that's something I control. So.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's the only thing you can really control.
Yeah. Tony, so let's get this conversation going. And, uniquely for a lot, if you're watching this or you're listening to this, we're doing this on a LinkedIn Live. So if you are in the LinkedIn Live and you have questions for Tony, I'm actually going to bring some of those questions into the show, because I do think it's important for people to ask these questions that want to, get to climb the corporate ladder, to hear from them as well. But I'm also going to approach it from a way as someone who, to be honest with you, for my first 5 years of my career, was heavily debating, do I want to pursue the corporate ladder route or do I want to go into entrepreneurship? And so as someone that was highly motivated or wanted to be considered a high potential employee, was getting promoted every 2 years, was having those conversations with my directors and vice president about where they saw me, not just in the next promotion, but 2-3 promotions ahead. I'm really intrigued to think about how you think about this stuff and some of the advice that you can share with the audience so that they can be successful in their careers and set themselves up for that. But as we get started with that, Tony, maybe take some time to share a little bit of your background, your story, and in how you were able to build such an amazing career in corporate America. I know that we have talked, but you have an impressive LinkedIn, climbing all the way to vice president in one of the biggest banks in North America. But I'll let you kind of tell it. I wouldn't want to steal your thoughts.
No, you're doing great, man. Keep on going.
No.
Seriously, appreciate that. I've often say it this way. I've had the great pleasure of, what I call 8 distinct careers, at RBC. And for those who are not in Canada, Canada's largest bank, and to your point, one of the largest in North America and the world. But I had the great pleasure, of working with an organization that provided me opportunities. I worked in personal banking, business banking, wealth management, financial planning, insurance, and I led sales teams. I was in sales. I started businesses. I ran businesses. And, over time, what I came to really appreciate is as the teams got bigger and I became more experienced, is coaching and mentoring really became a larger focus of what I did and a passion for what I did. So it was really just a natural extension, taking those experiences and then translating them to helping people who are in various industries, tend to be focused mostly, in financial services, but I've had clients in oil and gas and technology and so forth, but really helping them overcome the barriers, the personal barriers, the corporate barriers that they see and they face, and helping them to your point, be as successful as they dare, right?
Yeah, that's amazing. Tony, I wanted to talk through about what do you think is the major differences between getting promoted earlier on in your career and getting promoted later on in your career?
It's an interesting question, because I think that a lot of people start out in a career and measure success based on taking on a new job every year, 2 years. And to me, it's great that you move up through an organization, but it's also important that you take on roles that add tools to your toolbox. And I've often shared, and again, I'm have to understand, I'd like to tell stories, and we talked about this a little earlier. So early in my career, and I'll give you a perfect example. There are people in the bank or in banks start out in personal loans, and then they move into account manager, they become a branch manager, and then a bigger branch manager, and a bigger branch manager. And so to your point, they've had a lot of early success, but they reach a point where they've kind of had a siloed career, and they've really not built those tools and those skills. And so when they want to move, they don't really have that ability to compete, because they don't have that breadth of experience and knowledge. And very early in my career, I remember I was, in personal loans, and I was an account manager, and I got promoted after 9 months to a senior account manager. And 12 months later, my VP walks in and he says, "Bagnato," he says, "you're doing really well." And I said, "Thanks a lot." And he says, "Well, I think it's time for you to move on." He says, "You have a choice." He says, "You can, get into a job as a small branch manager." I'm 25 years old, 26 years old. I go into a small branch, or I can put you into commercial banking. And I said, "Well, his name was Ray." And I said, "Ray, I really appreciate that." I said, I it's comfortable. Personal loans is comfortable. I'm good at it. I'd like to continue on. Maybe coaching people and managing people would be fun." And he says, "That's nice, but you're going to business banking and you start in 2 weeks." And it was one of those career inflection points that really defined me, because what it did was it took me away from that comfortable path and put me down one that forced me to continually grow my experiences and knowledge. And I think ultimately led to the success I had. Now, to your question, I don't know if it matters if you have these early or late in your career. Some people starting a family or due to personal circumstances just want to, build success and then ultimately want to advance later. That's fine too. But you just got to find ways to broaden your skill set, no matter what time of the career it is.
So I love that, like that you're sharing that, because I was seeing similarities to extent of my early careers of understanding the career path. So I was fortunate enough to be in a management training program. So there's thousands of different roles within PepsiCo, but they do have different roles that from day one, you are in this fast track, you're considered a high potential, and you're doing a lot of roles, not because you're the most qualified person to do the roles, but you're doing a lot of roles to gain the critical experience required to do other roles. So you wouldn't become a director, like a territory manager, let's say, where you're overseeing all of Orlando sales, which is hundreds of millions of dollars in Frito-Lay chips alone, without first doing 3 key roles. You needed to be a district manager, so you understand the day-to-day side of running like a group of salespeople. The second one is a key account manager, where you're managing the relationships with key customers, the Walmarts, the Targets, the CVS of the world. And then you needed to be a ZBM, which is zone business manager, which is like the equivalent of a CFO of a particular business unit, where you're managing the P&L side of it.
Yep.
So you have the customer side, you have the employee side, and then you have the finance side. And when you had those critical experience, you can now become a director of an area. And then if you wanted to be a vice president, you need to be a director. And then you need to be the same thing, the equivalent of a VP of of a zone to do that.
Yeah.
And I find that really interesting, because I remember being put into these roles and being, promoted every 16 months or every 24 months, right? Because I'm just building critical experiences. Now, I know how lucky I am, or I was, or I am for getting those experiences, that I was in a program that was curating my career. And I know that doesn't always happen, and most of the time it doesn't happen for
Mhm.
for other companies or other roles. So I guess with this long story of my question to you, Tony, is what advice would you have for individuals to own their career
Mhm.
and start curating or try to figure out what roles should I try to look into so that they're able to curate their own management training program so that they can elevate through the corporate ladder much faster?
Yeah, it's a great question, and congrats. I mean, getting accepted to a graduate leadership program in any large multinational corporation is it really a testament to the way that you've sold yourself based on your experiences, based on your education, based on your passion, the grit that they saw. So they saw you in a leadership position, but don't ever lose sight of the fact that if you had stumbled along the way, you'd have been off that program pretty quick, right?
Oh
And
no,
I'm
I
sure
know.
you saw people get kicked off the program because they didn't meet the expectations. And so organizations have leadership development programs, whether they're formalized roles like yours, where you're going to do one role, two roles, people management role. And if you are successful, then you'll take on a director or senior director type role. But even without that, organizations, especially large ones, PepsiCo and RBC, as two examples,
Yeah.
have talent management programs. HR manages this, where every employee is looked at for their current potential, their future potential, and whether they're, and you already used the words, high potential, executive potential. And there is some support in managing their career. That's great. But to your point, how does an individual make sure that they're not waiting for that to happen? And so to me, it really comes down to a couple of things. One is learning how to communicate your value with an impact with confidence. And I use those terms quite often, but it really does speak to how are you ensuring that your manager and is fully aware of what you're doing. And it kind of sounds counterintuitive. Well, they're my manager. They should know. Sure, but they also manage 15 people. They manage a business. So how are you making sure that in advance of your reviews on a monthly, on a weekly basis, that you're providing them with the information on what you have done, the impact of that you've had, and the impact of your team? Because not only does it benefit you, it helps them in championing the business. If they need resources, they can say, here's the impact we've had, and they've got it at their fingertips. So that's number one. Number two is, how are you making sure that you're building your network within the organization, both inside the organization and outside, where you're not only communicating your value and creating relationships, but learning about the different opportunities that are available, how they're going to add to your toolbox and help you accelerate your career in the future. You don't want to be looking to apply for a job in a totally different area that you want to go into without the director or senior director or VP knowing who you are. You want to have it so that when that job comes up, they go, oh, remember that Daniel guy we talked to? I want to get him in for an interview. And so to me, it's really a combination of those two, communicating your value with impact and building a network of an awareness and knowledge of what goes on in the business so that you can build your career and have that aligned with what the organization is doing from a talent management perspective.
So many more questions that I now have. I'm
Yeah,
like
yeah.
writing 1,000 little things, right? I'm like learning, but also like, okay, I have a follow up question on this, right? How much of the politics are involved the higher you go into in a corporation?
Yeah, you know what? That's a very interesting question, and I think that to me it brings in two things. One is unconscious biases, which is very prevalent and unconscious to many. I know that early in my career, and again, indulge me as I tell stories, but I was leading a community in the eastern part of the city, and small area. I'm 29 years old. I've got a couple of branches. I got business banking and everything, and I got this young guy, and he's really aggressive and he's confident, and and I remember saying to somebody one time, I said, "This guy, he's got it. He's going to do really well." And this lady who had a lot of experience, she looked at me and says, "You know, he's you, right?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She says, "Have you looked at him? He looks like you. He dresses like you. He's now talking like you. He's acting like you." And that was my first experience with unconscious bias, where I realized I had it, and I was identifying with people who traveled my path. And so, what I've come to appreciate is the importance of, first of all, diversity of thought at the table. And I think about when I was leading in my last role, I led a sales advice center with we had 650 people and 500 advisors and team leaders and directors. And I remember saying that the most important thing I could have is that diversity of thought at my director table, and with my directors and senior directors, and also at my team leader level, and most importantly at my advisor level, because they need to mirror my population. And
Yeah.
so then I could look at it and say, okay, now that I've got that, how do I identify the people who have that ability and desire to move into ever increasing roles? Because not everybody is career oriented, right? And that's okay. Job oriented is fine as long as you do a good job. Career oriented are the ones that, from a leadership perspective, we want to put additional career development and mentoring against.
Yeah. And how much of that resources that, so every company, regardless of its size, whether it's Apple, Google, or Opni, whatever the size of the company is, we have limited resources. Even the US government has limited resources, which means that every time we want to hire someone or every time we want to invest into someone, we're making a conscious investment on saying, okay, if I am going to send Daniel to this conference, or I'm going to have Daniel go to headquarters and work with our trainers, or I'm going to send Daniel to this event, right? They're investing. They're essentially betting to say, hey, one, I think Daniel has the potential to do this, but two, I also think Daniel wants to stay in the company, so we don't want to just obviously train him and him leave, right? So there's this element of both. How much of those resource allocation has to do because the employee or that person is raising their hand to say, hey, Tony, I'm very interested in continuing development, versus some of those resources being tapping Daniel on the shoulder and saying, hey, we see potential in you, so we want to invest in you. Or, I mean, obviously it might be a mix of both, but we'd love to get your thoughts on how those decisions are made at the leadership level.
Yeah, yeah.
And what can someone do to get more of those resources allocated towards them?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think the risk is, and I'm sure it's happened in many, and probably still happens in many organizations, is that the person who puts their hand up the most, the person who expresses the most desire, the person who positions their value and says, hey, pick me, pick me, pick me, is getting those opportunities. But this is where having a structured leadership development program is so important, because what it does is you're asked on an annual basis as a vice president, senior vice president, or whatever, and then throughout your teams, to say, I want you to, here's criteria that I want you to rate all of your team on for discussion. And so I would sit down, again, I'll use my sales advice center experience. I had my 8 directors and who had 50 or 60 team leaders. And I would say, okay, I want you to look at all of our team leaders, and I want you to rate them based on this criteria. First of all, do they desire to move up? And I want to look at their leadership potential based on some defined characteristics I'm looking for. And then once we do that ranking, for lack of a better term, we talk about the individuals, because what that does is it identifies people who have that potential, and maybe they don't either have the confidence to ask for it, or, well, introverts versus extroverts, as an example, don't want to, step up and be vocal or public about it. I want to make sure that everybody's potential, based on their actual work performance and the impact of their outcomes, is being taken into consideration, as well as how they interact with other people, how they communicate. You don't need to be a manager of people to be a leader, as we know. And so are you seeing people who, and this is an old US brokerage thing, but like E.F. Hutton, when they walk into a room, people, when they speak, everybody listens, even though they're at a manager level with no direct reports. That's the type of individual who has the ability to impact at a higher level.
Yeah. No, I love that. I also want to ask you about the different skill sets that's required to be an executive versus the different skill sets that made you successful early in your career. So this is my theory, my hypothesis, right? And again, feel free to tell me I am an idiot and I don't know anything, because that could very well be true, because I might be speaking a little bit out of my comfort zone here.
Yeah.
I've noticed, and I see this a lot too for my small startup of 25 employees, right? So like level entry roles for me, if you just got hired for a entry level role in my organization, right? I would say 80 to 90% of your day is following an SOP.
Yep.
Following a systems, following a process, right? And actually, let's make this not about Opni. Let's think about McDonald's, right? So like McDonald's, right? That in the beginning, when you get for your first hire to flip burgers, you're following a process. Put the burger here for 2 minutes, flip it, just square the bottle once. It's perfectly it creates a standard process, which generates a predictable product, which wherever you go in the world, you're gonna get a really predictable experience. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have the CEO of McDonald's, right? That probably spends 90% of his day on things that are not an SOP. That are that he might have weekly meetings with the CFO or the board member. There's some meetings that are common, but most of the thing he's making decisions that someone hasn't made already, right? He's not following the process as much. Now, the time that you start your career to your end your career, you didn't like those skills need to change, right? And so the higher you go, and I think it's when you become a director. To me, is when you actually become an executive. That goes from a manager still managing processes, right? Not you could be a leader without a title, and you mentioned that, which I love, right? But at director level is now where you are now. That flips more to like more than half of your job is coming up with strategies and things like that.
Yep.
Where am I right? Where am I wrong on that theory from your perspective? And how do you start building those skills earlier on so that people can see, oh, this person has potential to be a leader?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a lot in there. So, let me address it. So first of all, you're right. And I've often, made the comment that the higher you go in an organization, the less you actually do, and that really is true because to your point, and I think about, I was talking to a young guy at, one of the universities. I do some, pro bono coaching with university students. And, he was starting at one of the large consulting firms. And I said to him, he's going on about career and everything like that. I said, you understand that your first role in a consulting firm is 90% billable hours. Like it's spreadsheet work and you just got to keep your head down. It's 90%, SOP stuff as you talk about, right? So you're correct. As you go on, you're going to be drawn into more opportunities to, provide your thoughts, provide your input. But when I think about, I'll think about strategic mindset. If I think at the CEO level, or I think about any executive level, or to your point, at that director level, I think of 8 real skills, for example, that I'm looking for an individual or that an individual will demonstrate at those levels. And so, it's that forward thinking, that being able to think 2 steps ahead. And, if you're a hockey fan, think of Wayne Gretzky. He always used to talk about going to where the puck is going to be, not where it is. And so having that 2-step ahead mindset, right? The other piece is big picture thinking, looking at the organization, but looking at the marketplace and looking at it all holistically would be the second piece. Opportunity awareness and flexibility, I think, is a real key. And when I say opportunity awareness, that really deals with understanding what the opportunities are. But I threw in flexibility because far too often you see leaders, and I'll say leaders, executives or whatever, own a project and they're not willing to give it up, even though they know that it's probably not a great idea based on some new insights, but they're scared to let it go because it's theirs. But a true leader is not only being able to identify the opportunities, but having the flexibility and self-awareness to let it go.
Yeah.
Risk management is kind of the next piece that I'm looking for people to demonstrate. Every organization has risks, understanding which risks you can mitigate and which risks you can't and how to deal with that accordingly. Resource allocation, how do you effectively allocate people, money, and technology, and doing that in a proper way to maximize return on effort and organizational impact. Communication effectiveness, and this is deep, and I, as you know, I focus on 3 things: leadership, communication, and confidence. But communication is at core of everything we do. And from an executive perspective, it's how are we communicating the organization's direction, doing it, being able to communicate change, talk to people about what's going to happen in a proactive, confident, and honest way. And so that's a key piece. I'll add in seeking feedback. I think that any good leader, any good professional knows that they have some blind spots. And I incorporate it into my coaching with my clients now. And I did it with my leaders back at RBC, where I sought feedback out because I can't be in the room with them all the time when they're working. So I would seek out feedback, and good leaders will do that. They'll ask people, what am I not good at? Kind of that after action review that people do after a big project, making sure they understand what could I have done differently, both from a technical and a behavioral perspective. I want to see if somebody invests in personal development. I think that's a really important piece, not because the organization's paying for it, because they think it's important. And I know people like you invest in coaches because that's how your career has gotten better. That's how, both when you were at Pepsi and I know as you're building out your business. And, you know, I also look at the last piece, you know, learning from the past is important, but I talk a lot about connecting the dots. And leaders have the ability to take disparate information from so many different sources and being able to crystallize it and articulate a simple, straightforward message and remove all the fluff and being able to execute. So they're kind of the 8 things that when I think about strategic mindset for a leader, and these are things that I talk to clients about and talk to my directors and senior directors about.
I'm like taking so many notes, and I'm like, this is incredible, right? Because I think you just describe in such a way that is easy to understand. And one of the things that really stood out to me is that most of those things are soft skills versus technical skills.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people are heavily focusing on their technical skills. And I wonder how much of that is like earlier in their career, you need more technical skills, like to be get those promotions. But at what point does it then start shifting to where it's the people skills, right? You said risk management, resource allocation, communication, seeking feedback, like all of those things are actually soft skills.
Yeah, you know, I did a lot of work with DECA. Are you familiar with DECA when
Yep.
you were at university?
Yeah.
And so in Canada, they changed it to ACE, but it's a case-based competition, and I work with a lot of students there. And first of all, I like calling them power skills because to me, they're not soft, you know, and I think about, you know, and so I say to students, understand that organizations hire you to solve problems. And when, as a student who has gone through DECA, you've learned about making complex simple, problem solving, presentation skills, time management, all these things. These are key skills that employers are looking for, whether you're an entry level position or if I'm looking at somebody who's a senior manager and I'm considering them to be a director. Now, the level of that competency and the way that they execute on it is going to be expected at a higher level as they move up in an organization. But there are foundational needs for all of these power skills for any employee. Because if you're technically really good at something, but you can't communicate with people, you're not going to last very long.
Yeah. No, so true. Tony, would be super interested to, you know, what are some of the key reasons why, you know, clients or, you know, people work with your or seek your advice?
Yeah, thanks. It's actually an interesting journey. I think that I learn something from every engagement with either a client or a prospective client. And you know, I would probably break it down this way. Those that are looking to, you know, they're in that senior manager, director level, or have aspirations for, you know, kind of executive or more senior level roles. The things that I hear that they're looking for or to get better at are things like coaching up, that ability to communicate to their manager, influence their manager, influence senior leadership. How do they do that both on the results, their activities, and the way that they communicate it? They'll also say to me that they want to understand what is said in the room. And I use that terminology to reflect that, you know, as an executive, I sat through many meetings where people were coming in and providing updates, introducing strategies, and so forth. So what these individuals who are in that role, where as a director, they may be presenting to a senior executive team, they want to understand, how do I communicate that message in the most impactful way? How do I, what do they want to hear? How do I present it? And the second part of that is, what's said in the room after I leave? Because they want to understand how executives talk not only about the initiative, but the individual. And how do I create that positive impact? Which goes back to your earlier comment about creating that awareness around the organization, right?
Yeah.
So that would be another one. What else am I thinking about? Strategic mindset, all the different things I talked about are key, you know, whether it is the emotional intelligence and opportunity awareness and how do you execute. And then executive presence, you know, or however people want to phrase that particular term. They want to understand kind of what it means. What are the qualities and behaviors that people are looking for? Because when you meet an executive, in most cases, you kind of know when they walk into the room.
Yep.
I don't know if you feel that as well or seen that as well.
I do. And sometimes I feel like, do I have a bias towards people that are more, I would say, extroverted on it? Because sometimes I've also seen like where people who are maybe are shyer actually make really great leaders.
Oh,
And
absolutely. I worked, my last 15 years was in the insurance group at RBC. And so I'm dealing with a lot of actuaries. So you're dealing with a lot of introverted individuals, brilliant technically, but in many cases, to your point, maybe not as outgoing. But the executive president isn't just about the confidence that they exude, because it's not just about being, flamboyant and, being
yeah,
speaking confident like we're doing right now. But, even in the way, in many cases, I've seen, individuals who are a lot quieter, but the way that they purposefully position things
yeah,
comes across in a very professional and confident manner. Not
yeah,
the way that I would do it, but that's just kind of that I'm that A-type personality, right? But it's also things like that emotional intelligence. How are they, listening with empathy, and how do they engage their teams? And authenticity is something that from an executive presence is so important. And these are just key things that are all foundational. No one is more important than the other, but there's just that whole toolbox of skills.
no, I love it. So Tony, as we're wrapping up, I have one more topic I want to ask you about, and then I want like, to close it up. I would love to hear your thoughts on imposter syndrome. As someone that I've dealt with imposter syndrome, I think everyone does, whether they admit it or not. I think we've all dealt with, am I good enough? Can I do this? Should I even apply for this role? Should I even raise my hand for this opportunity?
Yeah, I'm smiling because I hate the term. And let me be clear. It sounds to me like an incurable disease.
Yep.
And but I want to be really clear. The feelings are valid. They're absolutely they're absolutely valid and real. But I hate labels. And all I'm saying is, instead of talking about imposter syndrome, and by the way, it's on my website, like I refer to it because that's what people talk about. But
Mm-hmm.
for me, it's about what are the barriers that are causing you to not feel confident? Fear of failure, self doubt, judgment, being judged by others, for example. But what are the actions that you can take to help you feel more confident when dealing in these situations and overcome what you're calling imposter syndrome, which, in my opinion, I want to break down into, say, either self doubt or judgment or self confidence. So, again, it's real. I just don't like the term.
Yeah. No, I love Tony. As we wrap it up, I would love to learn a little bit more about how you work with your clients. Who is that? Those individuals. Like, if you were to say it's maybe the senior manager looking to become a director, who is your ideal person that you have loved working with, that you really have found that you can really elevate their career? And then from there, how do you work with them, and where can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I'll break it down into two things. One is, I mean, I have, given where I am in my career, I have the pleasure of working with people that I connect with. And what I mean by that is that, I have a complimentary discovery call with everybody, and I want to learn a little bit about them, what it is that they are seeing as a barrier to their growth. One of the first questions I ask is, what triggered you to reach out to me today? Because many of the issues that people have, the concerns they have, the barriers they see, have been there for a while, but something triggered it today. And understanding what that is really allows me to delve deeper. And so if I can build a personal connection, then I want to move forward. But it really then comes down to an individual who, to your point, is at that, manager, senior manager, director level, who does have aspirations for more senior level responsibilities, who is facing an internal or external barrier to them achieving that success, but is willing to be open to coaching, is willing to take constructive feedback, and is willing to work at it. Because I can talk about all my experiences and give them all sorts of different ideas, but if they're not willing to try different things, then they're wasting their investment, right?
Yeah.
So
Uh,
how do I deal with it? I break my engagements really into two parts. I have formal coaching where I focus on, key skills based on the individual. It's not a cookie cutter thing. I like to, once I understand your needs, I'll put a personalized program together because not everybody needs the same thing. So I'm going to focus our time on things like coaching up, communicating your value proposition, communicating your value. I'm going to focus on executive presence if that's where you are. And we're going to have focused sessions dealing with those. But about half of our engagement is going to focus on ad hoc meetings. because where we find real value is where you can bring me a problem, an issue, a situation you're facing today, and we can talk it through. And I can share my ideas. I can ask you questions. I can give you ideas, and then we can test it. Give you the confidence so that when you do have that meeting with your manager or with your somebody on your team or that presentation you got to give to the executive team, that you're ready and going to be doing it the best you can.
I love it. Tony, you are amazing. I have learned so much just from this podcast alone. So I could just imagine what it looks like when someone's working with you and more in a bigger setting. I have go ahead. I'm going to put, if you're watching this on LinkedIn, I have tagged Tony on the comment, so you can go ahead and click on that. Go to Tony's LinkedIn page. Send him a message. Schedule the complimentary discovery call. If you're listening to this on the podcast or on YouTube, check the show notes. Again, follow. We're going to have Tony's website, Tony's LinkedIn, all there. And if you've enjoyed this episode, we don't run ads here. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like and share it with a friend. If you can share this episode with one friend that maybe has aspirations to be an executive, that can hear this message, can hear this advice from Tony himself, please share this episode. That would be I guess the small price to pay to listen into this episode. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you all so much for listening, for watching, for being present in this podcast. We wouldn't be here without you, the audience. So thank you so much, Tony. Again, thank you. And I'll catch you guys on the next episode.